The sun hung low over the Solomon Islands on August 7, 1943. Major Thomas Lynch gripped the controls of his P-38 Lightning, his knuckles white beneath his flight gloves. Below him stretched the endless expanse of the Pacific, a deceptively calm canvas of blue that had already claimed thousands of lives. What was about to happen in the next 11 minutes would fundamentally change the air war in the Pacific theater, though Lynch himself had no idea of the revolution he was about to spark. For nearly 2 years, American pilots had faced a terrifying adversary in the skies over the Pacific. The Mitsubishi A6M0 had earned a reputation that bordered on mythical. Japanese pilots had used this remarkable aircraft to dominate the skies from Pearl Harbor to the Philippines, from Wake Island to the Dutch East Indies. Allied pilots whispered stories about the Zero's impossible maneuverability, its ability to turn inside any American fighter, to climb faster, to seem almost alive in the hands of experienced Japanese aviators. The statistics told a grim story. In the early months of the war, Zeros were achieving remarkable success ratios against American aircraft. For every Zero brought down, multiple American fighters were falling from the sky. The psychological impact was devastating. Young American pilots, fresh from training in the States, would arrive in the Pacific theater filled with confidence, only to learn within days that the aircraft they'd been taught to trust might become their tomb if they engaged a Zero in traditional dogfighting tactics. But Lynch was different. He'd been studying the enemy, watching, learning, refusing to accept that American fighters were simply inferior. The P-38 Lightning he flew was a strange bird, a twin-engine, twin-boom fighter that looked like nothing else in the sky. Lockheed had designed it with power and innovation, mounting 2 Allison engines on long booms that stretched back from the central nacelle where Lynch sat. It was fast, heavily armed with 4 .50 caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon clustered in the nose, and it could carry a significant bomb load. But against the Zero, conventional wisdom said it was at a disadvantage. The Zero could outturn the P-38. It could outclimb it at lower altitudes. In a traditional turning dogfight, the kind that pilots had been training for since the days of the Red Baron, the Zero held every advantage. American tactics manuals from 1942 were filled with warnings about engaging Zeros in turning combat. The advice was simple and frustrating. Avoid them if possible, run if you must. Never try to turn with them. Lynch had read those manuals. He'd also read the after-action reports, studied the gun camera footage, and talked to every pilot who'd survived an encounter with Japanese fighters. And he'd noticed something that others had missed. The Zero had weaknesses, significant weaknesses. The aircraft that seemed invincible in a turning fight was actually fragile. Its incredible maneuverability came at a cost. To achieve such lightness and agility, Mitsubishi had stripped away armor protection, self-sealing fuel tanks, and structural reinforcement. A Zero could dance through the sky like a hummingbird, but it burned like paper when hit. More importantly, Lynch had recognized that the P-38's perceived disadvantages were actually strategic advantages if used correctly. The Lightning was heavy, yes, but that mass gave it incredible energy retention in a dive. Its twin engines produced tremendous power, allowing it to build speed faster than a Zero. And at high speeds, the Zero's controls became heavy and unresponsive, while the P-38 remained stable and controllable. But understanding these facts intellectually and proving them in combat were 2 entirely different things. Lynch knew that changing doctrine, changing the way an entire theater of operations approached air combat, would require a demonstration so dramatic, so undeniable, that it could not be ignored. That opportunity came on this August morning. Intelligence had reported a large formation of Japanese aircraft inbound toward Allied positions in the Solomons. Lynch led his flight of 4 P-38s up to intercept, climbing through the tropical morning haze. At 20,000 feet they spotted them. 18 aircraft, a mixed formation of bombers escorted by at least 8 Zeros. Lynch's wingmen expected the standard protocol: approach from altitude, make a high-speed pass at the bombers, then extend away and climb back to safety before the Zeros could react. Hit and run, strike and disappear. This was the doctrine that had kept American pilots alive, even if it meant they couldn't always stop the bombers from reaching their targets. But Lynch had other plans. As they closed on the formation, Lynch's voice crackled over the radio. He was about to do something that violated every tactical principle that American pilots had learned in 2 years of bitter combat. He was going to deliberately engage the Zeros in a prolonged fight. Not just a quick pass, but a sustained engagement that would force the Japanese pilots to commit to combat at the P-38s' terms, rather than their own. His wingman must have thought he'd lost his mind. Lynch pushed his throttles forward, diving toward the formation not in a shallow, high-speed pass, but in a steep, aggressive plunge that would carry him directly into the middle of the enemy fighters. The P-38 accelerated rapidly, the airspeed indicator climbing past 300 miles per hour, then 350, approaching 400. At these speeds, the big Lightning felt solid and responsive. The controls were firm, requiring deliberate pressure, but responding precisely. The Zeros saw him coming and reacted exactly as he'd predicted. They broke formation, turning hard to meet this lone American fighter that dared to challenge them on terms that seemed suicidal. These were experienced Japanese pilots, veterans of campaigns across the Pacific. They'd faced P-38s before and knew how to handle them. You forced them into a turning fight, used the Zero's superior agility to get on their tail, and ended the engagement quickly. But Lynch didn't turn. As the first Zero pivoted sharply to cut across his path, Lynch did something unexpected. He extended. He pushed the nose down slightly and maintained his speed, blasting through the space where the Zero had expected him to be. The Japanese pilot, committed to his turn, found himself turning at empty air, while Lynch was already 1,000 yards past him, still moving at tremendous velocity. The Zero pilot tried to follow, rolling out of his turn and attempting to pursue. But he was now slow, his airspeed bled off by the hard turn. Lynch, meanwhile, had energy to spare. He pulled up gradually, converting his speed into altitude in a gentle climbing turn that kept his airspeed high. By the time he reached the top of his zoom climb, he'd gained 2,000 feet and was looking down at the Zero pilot who was struggling to follow. Now Lynch did something that would seem counterintuitive to every fighter pilot of the era. Instead of extending away to safety, he rolled over and dove back down toward the Zeros. But he didn't dive straight at them. He came down at an angle, building speed again, positioning himself not for a turning engagement, but for another high-speed pass. The Japanese pilots were confused. This wasn't how American fighters behaved. They weren't used to P-38 pilots who actively sought combat rather than fled from it. They reacted instinctively, turning hard to intercept Lynch's diving attack. And once again, Lynch refused to play by their rules. He made his pass, fired a burst at a Zero that was turning too slowly to evade, saw his tracers connect, and then extended away in another high-speed run. What happened next would be analyzed for decades in tactical flying courses. Lynch established what would later be called an energy fighting pattern. He used the P-38's advantages in speed and dive performance to dictate the terms of engagement. He would dive, build tremendous speed, make a firing pass at any Zero that was slow or poorly positioned, then extend away and climb before the Japanese pilots could bring their superior turning ability to bear. The Zeros tried to follow, but every time they turned hard to intercept him, they bled off airspeed. And every time they lost speed, Lynch gained a greater energy advantage. It was like watching a hawk hunting smaller birds. The hawk doesn't try to outmaneuver its prey. It uses altitude and speed, diving from above, striking, climbing away, then diving again. Lynch's wingmen initially hesitant, began to understand. They followed his lead, establishing their own energy fighting patterns. The sky became a three-dimensional chessboard where altitude, speed, and energy management mattered more than turn radius. One Zero pilot, frustrated by his inability to engage, made a critical mistake. He tried to follow Lynch up in one of his zoom climbs. The Zero could outclimb the P-38 at lower speeds, and the Japanese pilot probably thought he could catch the American fighter as it slowed at the top of its climb. But Lynch had maintained enough speed that, when he reached the apex of his climb, he still had the energy to roll over and dive away. The Zero, struggling to follow, hung in the air at the top of its climb, nearly stalling. Lynch reversed, dove back, and caught the Zero in that vulnerable moment. His concentrated nose armament poured fire into the fragile Japanese fighter. It disintegrated in a ball of flame. The engagement lasted 11 minutes. When it was over, Lynch and his wingmen had brought down 5 Zeros without losing a single P-38. More importantly, they disrupted the entire Japanese formation so thoroughly that the bombers never made it to their target. When Lynch landed back at base, his aircraft's guns were nearly empty, his fuel was low, and his heart was still pounding. But he'd proven something profound. The P-38 Lightning wasn't at a disadvantage against the Zero. It was simply being flown incorrectly. The after-action report from that mission spread through the fighter squadrons like wildfire. Pilots who had been flying defensive, hit-and-run tactics suddenly had a new playbook. The key wasn't to avoid the Zero's strengths. It was to impose the P-38's strengths on the engagement. But understanding a new tactic and implementing it across an entire Air Force were two different challenges. The real work was just beginning. General George Kenney, commanding the 5th Air Force in the Southwest Pacific, recognized the significance of what Lynch had demonstrated. Kenney was an innovator himself, always looking for ways to maximize the effectiveness of his forces. He immediately ordered his staff to analyze Lynch's tactics and develop a formal training program. Within weeks, experienced P-38 pilots were conducting flying demonstrations for newly arrived units. They showed young pilots how to manage energy, how to convert speed into altitude and altitude back into speed, how to recognize when an enemy fighter was vulnerable and when to disengage. The training emphasized discipline above all else. The temptation to turn with a Zero was overwhelming, especially in the heat of combat, when every instinct screamed at you to follow an enemy aircraft through its maneuvers. But the new doctrine required pilots to fight their instincts, to trust in the physics of energy management. The transformation wasn't instant. Old habits die hard, especially when those habits are tied to survival instincts. Some pilots couldn't resist the temptation to dogfight. They died. Others couldn't master the three-dimensional thinking required for energy fighting. They struggled to achieve victories, but at least survived. But a growing number of pilots embraced the new tactics completely, and they became devastatingly effective. Richard Bong, who had become America's top ace of World War II with 40 confirmed victories, flew P-38s exclusively. He mastered the energy fighting doctrine, combining it with exceptional marksmanship and an almost supernatural situational awareness. Bong would approach enemy formations with calculated aggression, assess the tactical situation in seconds, identify the most vulnerable target, strike with precision, and disengage before the enemy could respond effectively. Tommy McGuire, America's second highest scoring ace, was another P-38 pilot who embraced these tactics. McGuire was aggressive, perhaps too aggressive at times, but he understood that aggression had to be channeled through the discipline of energy management. He would later lose his life when he violated these principles in a moment of overzealous pursuit, a tragic reminder that the doctrine worked only when applied with discipline. The impact on combat effectiveness was measurable and dramatic. In the first year of the Pacific War, the Zero had achieved superiority in most engagements. By mid-1943, as Lynch's tactics spread through American fighter units, the balance was shifting. By late 1943 and into 1944, American fighters were achieving favorable exchange ratios. P-38 squadrons that fully embraced energy fighting tactics were bringing down multiple Japanese aircraft for every Lightning lost. The Japanese recognized the change but struggled to adapt. Their pilots had been trained in the philosophy of dogfighting, of using the Zero's incredible maneuverability to win turning engagements. This doctrine had served them brilliantly in the early war, but it was fundamentally based on their aircraft's advantages. Now American pilots were refusing to play to those advantages. Japanese tactical manuals began advising pilots to avoid diving attacks, to stay at lower altitudes where the Zero's climb rate was superior, to try to force American fighters into turning combat. But these defensive adjustments couldn't fully counter the Americans' new approach. Energy fighting gave the initiative to the P-38 pilots. They could choose when and where to engage, and they could disengage at will if the tactical situation became unfavorable. The psychological impact was as significant as the tactical one. American pilots who had entered combat with a defensive mindset, focused on survival rather than victory, now approached missions with confidence. The P-38, once seen as a compromise aircraft that was good at many things but superior at none, became one of the most sought-after fighters in the Pacific theater. Pilots requested assignment to P-38 units because they knew the Lightning gave them the tools to dominate the enemy if flown correctly. But the story of the P-38 versus the Zero wasn't just about one pilot's innovation or even about tactics. It was about the evolution of air combat doctrine in response to technological and tactical realities. The P-38 Lightning had been designed in the late 1930s in response to a U.S. Army Air Corps requirement for a high-altitude interceptor. Lockheed's design team, led by Clarence Kelly Johnson, created something radical. The twin-engine, twin-boom configuration was unconventional, but it solved several engineering challenges. The engine's counter-rotating propellers eliminated torque effects. The tricycle landing gear made the aircraft easier to handle on the ground. The concentrated nose armament meant that all guns converged at the same point, creating a devastating cone of fire without the convergence issues of wing-mounted guns. The aircraft had its quirks. The early engines were prone to problems in cold weather. The cockpit heating was inadequate at high altitude. The controls could become difficult in certain flight regimes, but these were engineering challenges that could be addressed with modifications and pilot technique. The fundamental design was sound. The Zero, in contrast, had been designed with a completely different philosophy. When Mitsubishi engineer Jiro Horikoshi sat down to design what would become the A6AM, his mandate was clear: create a fighter with unprecedented range and maneuverability. The Imperial Japanese Navy needed an aircraft that could escort bombers on long-range missions and had dominate enemy fighters in combat. Horikoshi's solution was brilliant, but came with compromises that would prove fatal. He achieved the required range and maneuverability by stripping away everything that wasn't absolutely essential. No armor for the pilot, no self-sealing fuel tanks, minimal structural strength beyond what was needed for the flight envelope. The result was an aircraft that could fly over 600 miles to reach a target, fight for an extended period, and return home. It could outturn any contemporary fighter, but it was terrifyingly vulnerable to battle damage. In the early months of the war, these compromises seemed acceptable. Japanese pilots were highly trained, often with combat experience from campaigns in China. They used the Zero's capabilities to avoid getting hit, striking first, and maneuvering out of danger before enemies could return fire. The tactic worked brilliantly against opponents who tried to dogfight them. But warfare is a constantly evolving competition. When one side develops a winning tactic, the other side must adapt or perish. Lynch's innovation, building on observations from many pilots and refinements from tactical trials, represented that evolutionary step for American forces. The principles behind energy fighting weren't entirely new. Fighter pilots in World War I had understood the importance of altitude and speed. The German ace Oswald Boelcke had codified energy management principles in his famous dicta back in 1916. But the specific application of these principles to the P-38 versus Zero matchup required new thinking. The Lightning's twin engines made it faster in level flight and in dives than single-engine fighters, including the Zero. Its sturdy construction meant it could sustain higher G-loads in high-speed maneuvers. Its powerful armament could bring down an enemy aircraft with a short burst if the pilot could get his guns on target. All of these factors combined to make it ideal for energy fighting, but only if pilots flew it correctly. Training programs evolved to emphasize these tactics. New pilots arriving in theater underwent intensive instruction before being assigned to operational units. They practiced dive attacks on ground targets to build the muscle memory for steep, high-speed approaches. They flew practice engagements where instructors played the role of Zeros, forcing the students to maintain discipline and resist the temptation to turn. The training was realistic and sometimes dangerous. Several pilots were lost in training accidents, but commanders deemed the risk acceptable. Better to lose pilots in training while they learned correct tactics than to lose them in combat while they learned the hard way. By 1944, the doctrine had solidified into a comprehensive tactical manual. The manual specified engagement techniques for various scenarios: attacking bomber formations, engaging enemy fighters, conducting sweeps over enemy territory, escorting friendly bombers. Each scenario had its own considerations, but all were built on the foundation of energy management. The manual emphasized key principles: maintain speed advantage, never allow yourself to become slow in enemy airspace, use altitude as a reservoir of energy that can be converted to speed when needed, attack from above when possible, diving through the enemy formation, and extending away before they can react. If you must turn, make it a high-speed turn that preserves energy rather than a tight, slow turn that bleeds speed. The manual also addressed the psychological aspects of combat. It acknowledged that energy fighting required discipline that went against natural instincts. When an enemy aircraft was maneuvering in front of you, the instinct was to follow it through its turns. The manual taught pilots to resist this instinct, to recognize that losing speed in a turning fight surrendered the advantage. Veteran pilots developed their own refinements to the basic doctrine. Some became experts at vertical maneuvers, using the P-38's power to yo-yo above and below enemy aircraft, attacking from unexpected angles. Others mastered the art of the running gunfight, engaging enemy formations in a series of high-speed passes that gradually whittled down the enemy's numbers while keeping the P-38s safe. The Japanese attempted to counter these tactics. They tried flying in defensive formations that made it harder for P-38s to make safe diving attacks. They positioned fighters at different altitudes to catch American fighters as they climbed away from attacks. Some Japanese units received newer aircraft like the Kawasaki Ki-61, which was faster and more rugged than the Zero, though still not as fast as the Lightning. But these countermeasures had limited success. The fundamental problem for Japanese forces was that American industry was producing aircraft faster than Japan could replace losses, and American training programs were turning out more pilots. Even when individual Japanese pilots were skilled enough to counter the new American tactics, they were increasingly outnumbered. The air war over the Pacific became a grinding attrition campaign where the side with more resources and better logistics would inevitably prevail. The P-38's tactical advantages, combined with American numerical superiority, created a situation where Japanese air power was steadily degraded. By mid-1944, Japanese air units in the Southwest Pacific were shadows of their former strength. Experienced pilots had been lost, and their replacements had far less training. The Zero, once feared, was now seen by American pilots as a relatively easy target if engaged correctly. Japanese bomber formations often couldn't reach their targets because P-38 sweeps would intercept and devastate them before they could strike. The contribution of Lynch's innovation to this transformation is difficult to quantify precisely, but it was undoubtedly significant. His demonstration that the P-38 could dominate the Zero, when flown correctly, gave American pilots the confidence and the playbook they needed. The tactics he pioneered became standard doctrine, taught to thousands of pilots and applied in countless engagements. Lynch himself continued flying combat missions, refining his techniques and mentoring younger pilots. He survived the war, having contributed not just through his own victories, but through the doctrinal revolution he sparked. Many pilots who never met Lynch owed their lives to the tactics he developed, tactics that kept them safe while making them effective in combat. The P-38 Lightning went on to serve in every theater of World War II. In Europe, it faced different challenges against different opponents, and the tactics had to be adjusted. The German Luftwaffe flew different aircraft and used different tactics than the Japanese. But the fundamental principles of energy fighting remained relevant. P-38 pilots in Europe learned to use their aircraft's speed and climb rate to advantage against German fighters, though the matchups were more balanced than in the Pacific. The Lightning's versatility proved valuable. It served as a fighter-bomber, a photo reconnaissance platform, and even as a night fighter. Its long range made it ideal for escort missions, protecting bombers on deep penetration raids into enemy territory. Its heavy armament made it deadly in ground attack roles, strafing enemy positions and destroying vehicles. But it was in the Pacific that the P-38 truly shined, and it was in the Pacific that Lynch's tactical innovations had their greatest impact. The combination of the Lightning's capabilities and the energy fighting doctrine created a dominant force that helped wrest air superiority from the Japanese and maintain it for the remainder of the war. The lessons from this period of the war extended far beyond World War II. Fighter tactics developed in the Pacific became foundational principles taught in military aviation schools for decades. The importance of energy management, the concept of fighting your aircraft's fight rather than your opponent's fight, the discipline to disengage when the tactical situation becomes unfavorable. These principles informed fighter doctrine through the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and into the modern era. Modern fighter pilots flying aircraft with capabilities that would seem like science fiction to Lynch still study the basic principles he demonstrated. The specifics have changed. Modern fighters have radar, missiles, and computer-assisted flight controls. But the fundamental physics of aerial combat remain. Energy management still matters. Knowing your aircraft's advantages and imposing them on the engagement still determines victory or defeat. The P-38 Lightning story is ultimately about more than one aircraft or one pilot's innovation. It's about the nature of military adaptation. When American forces first encountered the Zero, they were at a disadvantage. They could have accepted that disadvantage as an unchangeable reality, fighting defensively and accepting higher losses. Instead, pilots like Lynch observed, analyzed, experimented, and developed new approaches that turned perceived weaknesses into strengths. This adaptability, this refusal to accept defeat as inevitable, this willingness to question doctrine and try new approaches, these qualities proved as important as any technological advantage. The P-38 was a good aircraft, but it wasn't inherently superior to the Zero. It had different strengths. Lynch's contribution was recognizing those strengths and developing tactics that exploited them while negating the Zero's advantages. The historical record shows that after mid-1943, P-38 units consistently achieved favorable results against Japanese fighter opposition, Combat reports document numerous engagements where P-38 formations brought down multiple enemy aircraft while suffering minimal losses. The statistical evidence supports the tactical revolution that Lynch's August 1943 engagement symbolized. Individual pilots built impressive records flying the Lightning with these tactics. Gerald Johnson achieved 22 victories in the P-38. Charles McDonald scored 27 victories. Edward Cragg scored 15. J. Robbins achieved 22. The list goes on. Many of these pilots explicitly credited the energy fighting doctrine with their success, noting that they avoided traditional dogfighting and focused on speed-based tactics. The Japanese perspective on this tactical evolution is less well documented, but can be glimpsed in post-war interviews and captured documents. Japanese pilots expressed frustration with American fighters that refused to engage in turning combat. They noted that the P-38 in particular became increasingly difficult to counter as the war progressed, not because the aircraft changed, but because American pilots used it more effectively. Some Japanese pilots developed their own counter tactics, trying to force American fighters into situations where they couldn't disengage safely. But these individual innovations couldn't change the broader strategic reality. By late 1944, Japan was losing the air war through attrition, and no amount of tactical brilliance by individual pilots could compensate for the systematic erosion of Japanese air power. The technological arms race continued throughout the war. Japan developed new fighters like the Nakajima Ki-84 and the Kawanishi N-1K, both of which were better balanced designs than the Zero, with more armor and more power. America introduced new variants of existing designs and brought new aircraft into service, but the fundamental tactical approaches established in 1943 remained relevant. The P-38 itself evolved during the war. Later models had more powerful engines, improved systems, and better handling characteristics. The P-38J model, which became the most produced variant, addressed many of the early design issues. The engines were more reliable, the cockpit heating was improved, and the dive characteristics were refined. These improvements made the aircraft more effective as a platform for the energy-fighting tactics. But even with these improvements, the tactics remained essential. A poorly flown late-model P-38 would still lose to a well-flown Zero. The aircraft provided tools, but the pilot had to use those tools correctly. This remained true throughout the war and remains true in aviation today. Technology provides capabilities, but tactics determine how those capabilities are employed. Training continued to emphasize the lessons from Lynch's engagement and the subsequent tactical development. By late 1944, newly arrived pilots in the Pacific had typically received instruction in energy fighting before they ever left the United States. Training squadrons used captured or reconstructed enemy aircraft to provide realistic training opponents. Pilots practiced against aircraft that simulated Zero performance, learning to resist the temptation to turn and learning to maintain the discipline required for effective energy fighting. This investment in training paid dividends. The quality of American fighter pilots increased throughout the war, even as the average experience level decreased. Early in the war, replacement pilots often arrived with minimal training and had to learn combat tactics through dangerous on-the-job experience. By late in the war, replacement pilots arrived with sophisticated tactical training and could contribute effectively to their units much more quickly. The broader lessons about military innovation and adaptation extend beyond aviation. The P-38 versus Zero story illustrates how observing carefully, thinking critically, and being willing to challenge established doctrine can change the course of conflicts. Lynch didn't invent energy fighting. The principles existed in fighter aviation theory, but he demonstrated how to apply those principles to a specific tactical challenge, and his demonstration was convincing enough to change how an entire air force approached combat. This pattern of innovation demonstration, and doctrinal change appears throughout military history. Someone recognizes that the current approach isn't optimal. They develop a better approach through observation and experimentation. They demonstrate the new approach in a way that convinces others of its validity. The new approach spreads and becomes the new doctrine. Then the cycle repeats when someone else recognizes that even this new approach can be improved. The P-38 Lightning served throughout World War II and into the immediate post-war period. It was eventually replaced by newer jet-powered fighters as aviation technology continued its rapid evolution. But the tactical principles developed by pilots flying the Lightning remained relevant. The importance of speed, energy management, and fighting your aircraft's fight, rather than your opponent's fight, continued to be taught to new generations of fighter pilots. Today, the P-38 Lightning is remembered as one of the iconic fighters of World War II. Restored examples fly at air shows, and aviation enthusiasts study its history. The distinctive twin-boom shape is instantly recognizable. But perhaps the most important legacy of the Lightning isn't the aircraft itself, but the tactical revolution it enabled in the hands of innovative pilots like Thomas Lynch. That August morning in 1943, when Lynch dove into combat and demonstrated that the P-38 could dominate the Zero through proper tactics, marked a turning point in the Pacific Air War. It was a moment when one pilot's insight, courage, and skill changed how thousands of other pilots would approach combat. It was a demonstration that innovation in tactics could be as important as innovation in technology. The 11-minute engagement that day resulted in 5 confirmed victories and no losses. But its impact extended far beyond those numbers. It provided proof that American fighters could win, that the Zero wasn't invincible, that proper tactics could turn the tide. That proof spread through the fighter squadrons, was codified into doctrine, was taught to new pilots, and ultimately contributed to American air superiority in the Pacific theater. Lynch couldn't have known, as he climbed out of his P-38 that day, how significant his mission would become. He'd simply flown his aircraft to its strengths, used sound tactical principles, and achieved an impressive victory. But that victory, and the tactics it demonstrated, would echo through the remainder of the war and into military aviation history. The story of how one pilot's so-called reckless maneuver, though it was anything but reckless, being instead carefully calculated, made P-38s dominate Zeros, is ultimately a story about human ingenuity and adaptability. It's about recognizing that perceived disadvantages can become advantages when approached from a different perspective. It's about the courage to try something new when the old ways aren't working. And it's about how one person's innovation can change the outcome for thousands. The Pacific skies where Lynch and his fellow Lightning pilots fought are peaceful now. The young men who flew those missions are nearly all gone, their stories preserved in memoirs, after-action reports, and the occasional documentary. The P-38 Lightnings they flew are museum pieces, though a few still take to the air at air shows. Their distinctive engine sound a reminder of a different era. But the lessons endure. The principle that tactics matter as much as technology. The understanding that careful observation and analysis can reveal advantages in unexpected places. The knowledge that, even when facing a superior opponent in certain aspects, victory is possible if you fight on your terms rather than theirs. Lynch's 11-minute engagement on that August morning demonstrated all of these truths. It showed that the P-38 Lightning, flown correctly, was not inferior to the Zero, but was actually superior in a different kind of fight. It proved that American pilots could dominate the skies over the Pacific if they fought smart instead of fighting the way their opponents wanted them to fight. That demonstration changed everything. It turned the tide of the air war. It saved countless American lives. It contributed to the ultimate Allied victory in the Pacific. And it established tactical principles that remain relevant in military aviation today. This is the story of how innovation in tactics demonstrated through courage in combat, can change the course of history. This is the story of how one pilot's insight made the P-38 Lightning not just a good fighter, but a dominant force in the Pacific skies. This is the story of Thomas Lynch and the tactical revolution that followed his engagement on August 7, 1943. The sun that had hung low over the Solomon Islands when Lynch began his mission had climbed higher in the sky by the time he landed. But in those 11 minutes between takeoff and landing, something fundamental had changed. The myth of zero invincibility had been challenged and broken. The P-38 Lightning had proven itself not as a compromise or a stopgap, but as a formidable weapon in the hands of pilots who understood how to use it. And so the war continued, with American pilots now armed not just with a capable aircraft, but with tactics that allowed them to exploit that capability fully. The balance of power in the Pacific skies had shifted, and it would continue to shift in favor of the United States as more pilots learned and applied the lessons from Lynch's mission. This is how wars are won, not just through superior numbers or technology, though those help, but through the constant evolution of tactics and the courage of individuals willing to try new approaches when old ones fail. This is how one pilot's mission on one morning in the vast Pacific theater contributed to victory in the largest conflict in human history. The P-38 Lightning went on to achieve a distinguished combat record. The Zero remained a capable aircraft carrier in the hands of skilled pilots. But after August 1943, after Lynch's demonstration, the dynamic had changed. American fighter pilots knew they could win, knew how to win, and increasingly did win as they applied energy-fighting tactics in engagement after engagement. This is the legacy of that August morning, the legacy of Thomas Lynch's innovation, the legacy of the tactical revolution that made P-38 Lightnings dominate Zeros throughout the remainder of the Pacific War. It's a legacy written in the combat reports, the victory tallies, the saved lives of pilots who flew home because they'd been taught how to fight effectively. It's a legacy that extends beyond one aircraft or one war, teaching lessons about adaptation, innovation, and the human capacity to overcome challenges through thought, courage, and determination. The story of the P-38 versus the Zero and how one pilot's tactics changed everything reminds us that in any competitive endeavor, whether warfare or any other field, success comes not from accepting limitations, but from finding ways to turn strengths into decisive advantages. Lynch saw what others had missed, had the courage to test his theories in combat, and succeeded in demonstrating a better way. That demonstration rippled outward, changing doctrine, saving lives, and contributing to victory. And that, in the end, is how one pilot's carefully calculated maneuver made the P-38 Lightning dominant over every Zero it faced in properly conducted engagements for the remainder of World War II.